Good Thursday, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for December the 21st. Today, we're reading together in Esther chapters 1 and 2. We have moved on to our last text of the year as 2023 is drawing to a close. We're going to be checking out Esther, which you might remember that I mentioned that Nehemiah is the last historically chronological text in the Old Testament. It is the telling of the last events prior to the 400 years of silence, which is prior to Jesus' coming. But here we have Esther at the end of Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, this little cluster of text. But remember that it's not the way our texts are laid out is not in chronological order. Esther, many people believe, probably would fit actually somewhere between Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7. That is in between the coming of Zerubbabel back to the promised land, and then Ezra making his journey back to Jerusalem and Judah and the promised land. So probably somewhere in that time frame, we're looking at Esther, the events of Esther, probably taking place around 100 years or so after the Babylonian captivity. This is the story of the Jewish community that is living in Susa, the Persian capital city. One of the most interesting aspects of Esther, and that's borne out in the title of a resource for the text written by my friend Nathan Ward, is the title of his work is God Unseen, and that's because there is actually zero mention of God, whether the name God, Elohim, or the covenant name of Yahweh. There's none of that here within the text of Esther. So whenever we're reading through, we're not going to see any yellow highlights highlighting the explicit mentioning of God or anything that he does. So that is a very interesting aspect of this particular text. And yet, just because God is not mentioned does not mean that God is not active all throughout the text of Esther and the story that it contains. God certainly is in control. Again, even though He is never mentioned explicitly, what this text does is it leads us in some critical some consideration of some critical thoughts. Our part is to decide whether or not we're going to be on God's side or on those who are against him. Remember, he's in control. So are we going to be with him or against him? Um, are we going to be will we be part of his plan and working to accomplish that plan, or will we be working against that plan? These are questions that this text really leads us to consider. Again, God is in control. We have great confidence in that. We know from other texts that He is active in the kingdoms of men. Uh, but that doesn't mean we have to be told exactly how He is doing that. I think that's probably another good lesson that we learn from Esther is we don't have to be told explicitly God did this. We simply look at what might be coincidences, maybe maybe something we would often call a simple coincidence is actually God being at work again, even though we don't have that stated explicitly. Um, I think we have that a lot through Esther. There's going to be times whenever, especially Mordecai in chapter 3, is going to make some statements that I think certainly lead us to understand that God is working. And there's just going to be other coincidences as well, again, involving Mordecai and things he might hear or just coincidentally hear that leads to a good positioning of himself in the eyes of the king later on. There's just so many things that we're going to see here in Esther that just seem like random coincidences, but I would certainly attribute them to the working of God in the lives of these Jews who are in captivity in Susa, the Persian capital, again, about 100 years after the Babylonian captivity begins. So let's read here then in Esther chapters 1 and 2 today. And then tomorrow we'll get in it. We'll start a series of just single chapters for the day. But then I was just scanning through the text earlier, and chapter 10 is like 4 verses. So we'll be finishing up a day early from the schedule that I have. I think the way I have it scheduled out, we'll finish up a day early. We'll do chapters 9 and 10 together to finish out our read for this year. So let's read here then in Esther chapter 1 and verse number 1. Esther chapter 1, verse number 1. These events took place during the days of Ahasuerus, who ruled 127 provinces from India to Kush. In those days, King Ahasuerus reigned from his royal throne in the fortress of Susa. He held a feast in the third year of his reign for all his officials and staff, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles and the officials from the provinces. He displayed the glorious wealth of his kingdom and the magnificent splendor of his greatness for a total of 180 days. At the end of this time, the king held a week-long banquet in the garden courtyard of the royal palace for all the people, from the greatest to the least, who were present in the fortress of Susa. White and blue linen hangings were fastened with fine white and purple linen cords to silver rods on marble columns. Gold and silver couches were arranged on a mosaic pavement of red feldspar marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in an array of gold goblets, each with a different design. Royal wine flowed freely, according to the king's bounty. The drinking was according to royal decree. There are no restrictions. The king had ordered every wine steward in his household to serve whatever each person wanted. And Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women of King Ahasuerus's palace. On the seventh day, when the king was feeling good from the wine, Ahasuerus commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who personally served him, to bring Queen Vashti before him with her royal crown. He wanted to show off her beauty to the people and the officials because she was very beautiful. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command that was delivered by his eunuchs, and the king became furious, and his anger burned within him. The queen consulted the wise men who understood the times, for it was his normal procedure to confer with experts in law and justice. The most trusted ones were Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Merez, Marsena, and Memucan. They were the 7 officials of Persia and Media who had personal access to the king and occupied the highest positions in the kingdom. The king asked, according to the law, what should be done with Queen Vashti, since she refused to obey King Ahasuerus' command that was delivered by the eunuchs. Memucan said in the presence of the king and his officials, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but all the officials and the peoples who are in every one of King Ahasuerus' provinces. For the queen's actions will become public knowledge to all the women and cause them to despise their husbands and say, well, King Ahasuerus ordered Queen Vashti brought before him, but she did not come. Before this day is over, the noble women of Persia and Media who hear about the queen's act, will say the same thing to all the king's officials, resulting in more contempt and fury. If it meets the king's approval, he should personally issue a royal decree. Let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes so that it cannot be revoked. Vashti is not to enter King Ahasuerus' presence, and her royal position is to be given to another woman who is more worthy than she. The decree the king issues will be heard throughout his vast kingdom. So all women will honor their husbands, from the greatest to the least. The king and his counselors approved the proposal, and he followed Memucan's advice. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to each province in his own script, and to each ethnic group in its own language, that every man should be master of his own house and speak in the language of his own people. Chapter 2, sometime later, Esther chapter 2, verse 1, sometime later when King Ahasuerus' rage had cooled down, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what was decided against her. The king's personal attendants suggested, Well, let a search be made for for beautiful women, excuse me, for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners to each province of his kingdom, so that they may gather all the young women, all the beautiful young virgins to the harem at the fortress of Susa. Put them under the supervision of Haggai, the king's eunuch, keeper of the women, and give them the required beauty treatments. Then the young woman who pleases the king will become queen instead of Vashti. This suggestion pleased the king, and he did accordingly. In the fortress of Susa, there was a Jewish man named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Kish had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the other captives when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon took King Jeconiah of Judah into exile. Mordecai was the legal guardian of his cousin Hadassah, that is, Esther, because she had no father or mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was extremely good looking. When her father and mother died, Mordecai had adopted her as his own daughter. When the king's command and edict became public knowledge, and when many young women were gathered at the fortress of Susa under Haggai's supervision, Esther was taken to the palace into the supervision of Haggai, keeper of the women. The young woman pleased him and gained his favor so that he accelerated the process of the beauty treatments and the special diet that she received. He assigned 7 hand-picked female servants to her from the palace and transferred her and her servants to the harem's best quarters. Esther did not reveal her ethnicity or her family background because Mordecai had ordered her not to make them known. Every day, Mordecai took a walk in front of the harem's courtyard to learn how Esther was doing and to see what was happening to her. During the year, before each young woman's turn to go to King Ahasuerus, the harem regulation required her to receive beauty treatments with oil of myrrh for 6 months, and then with perfumes and cosmetics for another 6 months. When the young woman would go to the king, she was given whatever she requested to take with her from the harem to the palace. She would go in the evening, and in the morning she would return to a second harem under the supervision of the king's eunuch Shaashgaz, keeper of the concubines. She never went to the king again unless he desired her and summoned her by name. Esther was the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as his own daughter. When her turn came to go to the king, she did not ask for anything except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, keeper of the women, suggested. Esther gained favor in the eyes of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Ahasuerus in the palace in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women. She won more favor and approval from him than did all of the other virgins. He placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen in the place of Vashti. The king held a great banquet for all his officials and staff. It was Esther's banquet. He freed his provinces from taxes and gave gifts worthy of the king's bounty. Verse number 19, when the virgins were gathered a second time, excuse me, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther did not reveal her family background or her ethnicity as Mordecai had directed. She obeyed Mordecai's orders as she always had while he raised her. During those days while Mordecai was sitting in the king's gates, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the entrance, became infuriated and planned to assassinate King Ahasuerus. When Mordecai learned of the plot, he reported it to King Esther, and she told the king on Mordecai's behalf. When the report was investigated and verified, both men were hanged on the gallows, and this event was recorded in the historical record in the king's presence. That is the reading of Esther chapter 1 and Esther chapter 2. Again, the focus here is on the Jews who were living in the capital fortress of Susa within the kingdom of the Persians. Ahasuerus is the king, which might be an unfamiliar name to us, maybe more familiar to us if we are informed historically of the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, is the name Xerxes. This would have been Xerxes, and Xerxes' reign, as was the case with the reign of most new kings, the first couple 2 to 3 years was spent having to stomp down rebellions among the vassal states that the king ruled. Normally, there was a transition of power. These vassal states would test to see whether or not they would be able to free themselves from underneath the rule of these greater kingdoms. So that's what Xerxes is having to do for a while. I think there was one specifically that took place in Egypt that he had to go address. So after all this had taken place, after he had gained firm control over the kingdom and those vassal states that he was in control over, it says that he had this incredible feast at Susa in the third year of his reign. All of his officials, the staff, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles, the officials from the provinces, everybody came. And for 6 months, for 180 days, he had this incredible feast, this great, unrivaled type of feast, basically just to celebrate his power and to help people to understand that, hey, I took care of the issues and you can have confidence in me. And oh, by the way, why don't we go ahead and make some plans to go and battle against the Greeks? If we can take care of these individuals down south, and maybe we can head up north a little ways and have some success against the Greeks, which historically speaking, that ends up not being the case. Nevertheless, this is just a completely uh, vain endeavor, not just in this feast, but also in the week-long feast that's going to take place in the courtyard following. All that's being done here is a flaunting of wealth. That's all it is. And one of the things that we'll notice about the Persians as we go throughout this text is that they really just like to go overboard on things. There's so much extravagance. There's so much exaggeration. There's not a lot of level-headedness among the Persians as the author describes them here within this text. And I think that's purposeful to show what happens whenever there's not careful consideration of the facts and well-reasoned wisdom guiding the processes that are being considered. Of course, one of the issues here is just the free flowing nature. Say that say that 3 times fast. The free flowing nature of the alcohol within this party, as we could assume would be the case. There is one rule, and that one rule is that there are no rules concerning the alcohol. So you can imagine that on the seventh day of this shorter feast, when the king was feeling good from the wine, whenever he's totally intoxicated along with other people, he says, "Okay, well, now's the time for me to bring out my queen. She needs to put on her royal crown," which there's some debate on what this means. Some ancient Jewish writers said that this means that Queen Vashti was paraded around this banquet wearing nothing but her crown. But others argue, probably more so, that this is a symbol for just her royal regalia as a whole. That it would be the queen's crown, along with the queen's normal royal attire, especially for a special occasion. But again, this is simply just a flaunting of the wealth of King Ahasuerus slash Xerxes in front of all these people that he's trying to impress. But Vashti, she's not going to be just this symbol of pride for Ahasuerus. She was very beautiful, but she's not going to be used, and she just refuses to participate in what the king has said, which of course angers the king. He becomes furious. He calls together his wise men, because that was his normal procedure. One of the things we see about Xerxes as well, or Ahasuerus, is that he doesn't really make many decisions for himself. He relies upon the determination of others. So he calls all the wise men together, and he lays out what has taken place. He says, according to the law, what should be done with Queen Vashti, since she refuses to obey the king's command. And the one particular wise man Memucan, he steps up and he says, well, she's not only embarrassed the king, but she's embarrassed all of us. And, that her behavior, again, this is very much, I think, exaggerated and overblown, but her behavior is going to have an impact on all the women throughout the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, and the fact that all the women now are going to rebel against their husbands, um, just leading to more contempt and fury. Excuse me. So we need to tamp this down right now. We need to let this be recorded in the laws of Persia and Media so that it cannot be revoked. Number one, that Queen Vashti is no longer to be allowed in the king's presence, which is kind of funny because she's being punished by that which she chose to do in the previous situation, which again, just interesting. But then secondly, she's no longer going to be Queen Vashti, where we're going to find a new queen for you. So um, we're going to show people that you women, you've got to stay in your places, and the men need to make sure that they are masters of their own houses. So we're going to send out this letter to let everybody know what's going on and to reaffirm the way things should be. So that's chapter one. The situation, Ahasuerus' great vanity being on display, his inability to make a decision on his own, and again, just everything being overblown, everything being exaggerated to just a silly extent, so that it leads to this particular decree. Well, sometime later, chapter two, once King Ahasuerus has come back to a more sober mindset, after he's come off his intoxicated levels, he recognizes that, I don't have a queen anymore. So what are we going to do about that? So they say, well, we're going to gather up beautiful young virgins from the kingdom so that you can go through basically a bachelor process. If you know anything about the Bachelor TV series, that's basically what takes place here. It's one man and a whole lot of women, and he's going to work his way through the women to determine which one pleases him the most, and she's going to become queen. So this process begins, and then we're introduced at this point to the Jews of the story. Number one, Mordecai, but then his cousin, who he is the legal guardian of, Hadassah, is one name for her, but her name that she goes by within this text is Esther. Um, Esther, we're told, is a very beautiful young lady, but she's an orphan. Again, her cousin Mordecai, who's much older than her, it seems, has become her legal guardian, and she becomes involved in this process as well. So she gets taken, along with many other of the beautiful young women, to the harem of King Ahasuerus. She, along with the rest of the women, also begin these treatments to prepare themselves to be brought before King Ahasuerus. But Esther gains favor with Haggai, who is the keeper of the women, and he gives her special treatment. So there's probably a lot of Daniel echoes going on here within this text. Again, Jews in a foreign land being put through a process to make themselves better, make themselves stand out. Um, so she goes throughout this process for the year. All the women take their turns being brought before King Ahasuerus. They're brought to him in the evening time, and in the morning they are sent off to a second harem. So you can probably read between the lines what's going on there. That they begin in one harem as beautiful young virgin women, and then they are transferred to a second harem. With that no longer being the case, having spent the night with the king, and from there they don't go back to the king unless he calls for them once again. So again, this is just the king figuring out which woman that he wants to take from all these different women. Esther herself participates in this, and it's I think important to recognize that the text does not give us any sort of moral judgment on this, whether or not she should have done this. Again, we think about the parallels from Daniel. Daniel stood his ground, did not do the things that he did not feel comfortable doing. Esther doesn't do that. Maybe that is because Esther is in a much more vulnerable position as a female before the king. Again, we just don't know. We just don't know why things played out the way they played out. And again, there is no moral judgment given to us by the author here. That's not his concern. His concern is just the working out of this entire plan and process. and story in order to reach to the final conclusion of how everything works out. So eventually, once once Esther goes before the king, uh, she actually ends up gaining great favor before the king. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she had more favor and approval from him than did any of the other virgins. He placed a royal crown on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. So he holds again another big banquet, and as a matter of celebration, he frees the provinces from tax payments and gave gifts worthy of the king's bounty. So this part of the story now has reached its conclusion, where the king gets rid of his first queen, or at least the first queen that was mentioned to us. He now has his second queen. But one of the things that I did not mention that is important to recognize here is that he does not know that his queen is one of the foreigners. Mordecai told Esther to not reveal her ethnicity or family background to the king, and that still seems to be something that is not known at this time. So while all this is going on, after Esther is the queen, the text tells us that Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Again, Esther has still not revealed her background. As Mordecai had done, she obeyed Mordecai. And Mordecai sitting at the king's gate, again, this place where a lot of business was conducted, where many of the important people would go on a daily basis. Mordecai just so happens, very coincidentally, wink, wink, to hear of an assassination plot being put together by these two eunuchs of the king. And what does he do? Well, he goes and tells Queen Esther about this assassination attempt. She goes to Ahasuerus, who investigates the plot, finds out that it was legitimate, and ends up putting those two men to death, hangs them in the gallows. And then the last thing we'll note here in chapter 2 is this important sentence: this event was recorded in the historical record in the king's presence. That's going to come into play much later on, about chapter 6, I believe it is. So far we have, again, the main players here that are involved is King Ahasuerus, Queen Vashti, who is removed from her place as the queen. The search for a new queen involves a Jewish girl, or a young Jewish lady named Esther. Her guardian, her adopted father, will say Mordecai, is known among the people and has a place among the people. And after she becomes queen, he just so happens to hear about an assassination attempt, which is then recorded in the king's logs. So where's God in all this? Where is he? Of course, he's not mentioned explicitly, but we do see, again, I think, a lot of coincidences that just seem a little too good to be true. Now, in our next text tomorrow, as we read here in Esther chapter 3, we're going to see the issue. We're going to see kind of the trouble that presents itself for God's people in a foreign land in the form of Haman, a descendant of Canaanites, who is, again, non-coincidentally going to have a disdain for Jews. We're going to see the issues that he presents and how that's going to help progress the story forward. If you have any questions about this text here in Esther chapters 1 and 2, please feel free to leave that in the comment section below. And I do appreciate you taking some time to read along with me on this Thursday. We'll be back at it again tomorrow on Friday, reading together from Esther chapter 3. Hope that you'll tune in then. Thanks so much again. Have a great rest of your Thursday. Take care, and God bless.